get going. My lawyers have urged me to read the following presentation and precaution before we go on. It goes as following. This presentation is brought to you by permission of Lin-Manuel Productions and cannot be reproduced, transmitted, or used commercially without the express consent of the author. So I got the express consent of the author because the author was beholden to a fellow historian who I'll be talking about soon, Ron Chernow. And Chernow said I can talk about it even though he did write the book. All of you have done your homework, so you're going to come in rather knowledgeable. What was your homework? Your homework was namely to see the show. And I suspect a lot of you have seen the show, maybe once, maybe more than that. You've got cheap seats tonight. They're on the aisle, they're orchestra, so you're in good shape. You probably know for many of his performances, Lin-Manuel would come out before the show and there'd be a lottery and he'd give 10 tickets away to just about anybody who was sitting in the cheap seats, enabling them to get orchestra seats. This is not gonna be a history lesson. You've all been to college. You've had probably basic American history. Don't want to repeat too much of what you probably remember. But we're gonna start in the West Indies. And as Buddy reminded us, we are probably gonna definitely end up in Weehawken. I think a lot of this will come out when we get to the question period. Although, as I've said in the past, if there are things that I've said that you want to comment on or question, don't wait till the end. You'll probably forget, or we may run out of time. So we have Joy here monitoring everybody. Thank you, Joy. And certainly will respond to, yeah, Joy happens to be in a parking lot heading up to Massachusetts. So give her exceptional credit for going out of her way to accommodate us.
I just want to say for anybody who hasn't joined us before, a couple of months ago, Zoom took away the ability for me to unmute you. So I can mute you, but I can't unmute you. So if you want to say something, you can unmute yourself and just make the point. Richard's really great about doing that, so just make sure you can unmute yourself. If for some reason you can't figure out how to do that, it is pretty simple on most of the devices. If you see at the bottom, you have a list of controls. You can just mute and unmute yourself. On some of the iPads, it's at the top. If for some reason you don't see that, you can also use the chat function, and I can ask Richard your questions for you.
Thank you, Joy. We've all revered the founding fathers. History likes winners, and they won. I guess had they lost, we might have referred to them as the floundering fathers. But admittedly, our enthusiasm for Alexander Hamilton was never too great. As Lin-Manuel puts into the script, quote, his enemies destroyed his rep, America forgot him. So Lin-Manuel was aware that he was dealing with a personage who had to be rehabilitated. And the question is, how did we rehabilitate him? I mean, if I would have given this talk several years ago, there'd be little interest on the part of anybody because Hamilton was kind of submerged and was not particularly well regarded among the founding fathers for a number of reasons, which I'll mention. Now, of course, the situation is different. Thanks to Ron Chernow, who wrote this 700+ page book, a biography of Alexander Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda, of course, and even more recently, John Bolton's book. Why John Bolton's book? Well, what was the name of the book? In the Room Where It Happened. Where do you think he got that from? From a lyric from the show. Even Mary Trump just wrote a book. She didn't call it In the Room Where It Happened, but she was in the room where it happened. And she told us how Fred Trump dumped potatoes on his friend and son, Donald Trump, to embarrass the hell out of him. So why has Hamilton's reputation been diminished until fairly recently? A few explanations. One, his boss got far more attention. Who was his boss? Well, he worked, as you'll see, for George Washington, commander-in-chief, so he was an underling. He then worked for George Washington, President of the United States. He was in his cabinet, but an underling. It's also fair to point out that all of you have far more to say and feel more sentimentally attached to Thomas Jefferson than you do to Alexander Hamilton. So Jefferson has kind of submerged Hamilton in this duo that we associate with the early years of the nation. Also, if you notice, who becomes our presidents for the first 20, 30 years of the nation? They're either from Virginia, namely, of course, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, or they're from Massachusetts, namely Adams and John Quincy Adams. So in a sense, Virginia and Massachusetts have pushed out New York. New York always seemed more commercial, more polyglot, didn't have a story comparable to the story of Massachusetts with the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the story of Virginia. And also, I should acknowledge that we've disfavored Hamilton because we did not see him as a Democrat. We saw him as someone who was suspicious of the people, who spoke occasionally about curbing the mob, who at the Constitutional Convention seemed to favor almost an appointed monarch, or at least a president for life. So he seemed to be out of step with what we thought the revolution had wrought. And then, so what did he do? His principal contribution was with the Treasury Department, Secretary of the Treasury. Well, he did extraordinary things, but who can get excited about currency and tariffs and taxes and things of that sort? So there's no high drama in it. I mean, no one's getting excited about Mnuchin these days, except if he agrees to give us more money on this New Deal, but that has yet to materialize. So the point is, and also I think it's fair to say that Hamilton was an immigrant. You know, he wasn't born here. He wasn't made in America. And therefore, when you're trying to credit those who deserve recognition, it's easier to see someone born in the colonies rather than someone who's come from overseas. I mean, that shouldn't be the reason, but it may just have been. In fact, there's a duet between Lafayette and Hamilton in the show, and they say, immigrants, we get the job done. So they're trying to compensate for their perhaps lower status in the American pecking order. But okay, so we've not given Hamilton his due, but of course, Lin-Manuel certainly has. And one of the reasons he did, I mean, this is extraordinary. As a historian, I appreciate it. He actually read Ron Chernow's 700-page book. He was on vacation in Mexico. Somehow the book got into his hands. This is after he had done the show Up in the Heights, and I guess he was looking for another vehicle to write. Now remember, he not only writes the story, but he also composes the music. So it is quite an accomplishment. But the fact is, he calls Chernow and says, I read your book, I love it. I want to do something with you, and not just for you to eliminate some of the falsehoods or tell me where I went wrong, but I'd like you to really collaborate and give me some sense of your understanding of the times and of Hamilton and of Jefferson and of Aaron Burr and so forth. So it's a marvelous collaboration, very unusual. Usually you bring a historian in at the end and say, if you had committed any faux pas or really misconstrued, I'd like to hear from you. They collaborated for 6 years. It took them a long time. It took them 1 year to compose the first song. It took him another year to compose the second song, until his backers were saying, hey, Lynn, you got to speed this up. It'll never come out. It finally came out, as you know, in 2015. But the key, not only did he use a real historian, and therefore virtually everything that you see or you hear in the lyrics is largely accurate. He's changed a few chronological situations. He's put people together who weren't together, but there is no major departure from the historical record. And of course, what he also did, he had the brilliance and the insight to do it in rap, Now, if you read the lyrics, they are thick with words, all over the place. And therefore, a lot of the words of Chernow, a lot of the words of Hamilton's correspondence, Hamilton wrote 10,000 letters. Some of these words found their way into the lyrics. And of course, he also had the brilliance to introduce a people of color in the cast. A wonderful innovation. Although if you remember, I think a few years before that in Carousel, Billy Bigelow was played by an African-American, but here, a good part of the cast were people of color, which was really a cultural breakthrough. Very, very significant, particularly in these days. And Lin-Manuel saw the immigrant story as key to the show. Lin-Manuel, being an immigrant, son of an immigrant from Puerto Rico, thought the immigrant story was one that he should feature. And on many occasions, Hamilton and others make reference to that. And of course, an immigrant comes with baggage, an immigrant comes with decided disadvantages. And therefore, part of the appeal of the Hamilton show and of Hamilton himself is the Horatio Alger theme. As you'll see, he came with nothing. His background was very disturbing. And of course, his achievements were transcendent. Very similar story, which obviously I'm not going to go into, with Benjamin Franklin. Franklin ran away from his brother, who he was apprenticed to in Boston. He fled to Philadelphia with nothing. And of course, he achieved an extraordinary number of achievements in his lengthy lifetime. So there are interesting parallels between Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, and both of them followed the scheme of Horatio Alger. And the other final point I'd make before we get into some of the details is that Lin-Manuel saw this show as a major expression of American patriotism. You know, patriotism in your lives and in mine has often been the possession of the right, of conservatives. You know, the flag and the Star-Spangled Banner and all that stuff. Well, Lin-Manuel took this show, made it very patriotic to demonstrate that patriotism should be for everybody, whether liberal or conservative. All right, so much for just general reflections. The most critical part of my discussion, of course, now follows. The essential question, was Alexander Hamilton Jewish? Did he change his name from Hamlish to Hamilton before he came to the colonies? Now, you may say that's funny, and maybe it is, But the fact of the matter is that serious historians have actually reflected upon and considered the possibility, however remote it may seem, that there is Judaism in Hamilton's background. What does this rely upon? He came from a West Indian island, Nevis, Nevis, where there was a substantial Jewish population. He was not permitted to enter a church school because his mother had children out of wedlock. And so the record seems to indicate that he went to and was tutored by a Jewish schoolmistress. In addition, it is said, I didn't hear him do this, but he was able to recite the Ten Commandments in Hebrew. So there obviously is some affinity between Hamilton and Judaism. And then he had this to say, which is a rather remarkable statement. The state and progress of the Jews from the earliest history to the present time has been so entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs that it is the effect of some providential plan. In other words, kind of believing that in some way Jews were God's chosen people. It's one statement. I'm not sure there's much else to add here. What's the other evidence? Well, as you'll see, he was sent by some well-to-do folks in the West Indies to study in the colonies with the expectation that he'd become a doctor and come back and minister to the population back in the West Indies. Well, who becomes doctors? Of course, Jews do. So that kind of is very suggestive. He didn't become a doctor. What did he become? He became a lawyer. Well, Jews become lawyers as well. So that's further evidence. And then we know he went to Columbia. Well, we all know that Columbia has always had a high Jewish population. So that kind of secures that notion as well. Jews tend to be short overall. Well, Hamilton was only 5'7", so maybe that's a factor in that as well. Hamilton was interested in banking. Well, who else was interested in banking? You know, the Rothschilds, Goldman Sachs. So his interest in banking probably helps reinforce the notion that he might have been Jewish. He ended up on the $10 bill. Well, you know, Jews are supposedly drawn to money, so maybe that's part of it as well. In addition, Ron Chernow, the historian's father's first name was Israel. Well, you know, that should clinch it. That should clinch it. And we know that Hamilton was smart enough to marry a very rich girl. He married Eliza Schuyler. The Schuyler family owned practically all of Upper New York State. So if you want to develop evidence for Hamilton's Judaism, I've given you enough material here to build your case. Of course, I'm mostly kidding, but do leave you with the fact that some historians actually think it's worth pursuing, but the evidence is rather scanty and will probably never be conclusive. Okay, let's take Hamilton as a young person. One of the problems, we are not sure when he was born. He's not sure when he was born. The records are contradictory or unavailable. He was either born in 1755 or 1757, and his background is very disturbing, as I've mentioned. Here we have Hamilton as a young boy. His mother leaves her first husband. He apparently is very abusive, and she leaves him. And then she enters a relationship with James Hamilton. Hamilton, for a variety of not clear reasons, leaves her. Shortly thereafter, Hamilton's mother dies. He is then sent to live with a relative. That relative, after a year, commits suicide. And so we have a background which you can well imagine was insecure, unsettled, and he is an orphan. We can refer to him as the foundling father. So what has he got in his favor? In his favor, he's an exceptionally precocious young boy. He reads. He gets a job at a trading company as a teenager, and the owner of the company, it's a very extensive company with connections in the West Indies and also in the American colonies. And the owner goes away for a 6-month cruise, and he leaves Hamilton in charge, and he was able to function at the head of this rather complicated trading company, doing the books, buying the produce, making sure that pirates don't capture the ships, a very, very responsible position, which he does quite capably at the age of maybe 14 or 15. And then a hurricane hits the islands, and he writes a lengthy piece given his reflections as to the meaning of the hurricane. One fragment, which I quote, "The hurricane," he said, "was a divine rebuke to human vanity and pomposity." I mean, this is a teenage kid writing this way. There's something rather special about it. Well, what was special is that some influential people he had moved to St. Croix now, saw the article, said, "This guy is something special. Let's pay for him to go to the colonies and get an education. He'll then come back and be of use to the community." So they get up a sum of money and they send him off to the colonies in 1772 and 1773. He is clearly ambitious, capable, precocious. And in one of his last letters, he writes, "I wish there was a war. I wish there was a war." His ambition was such that he felt that a war would elevate him beyond any position that he might have in the West Indies. I don't know that our kids or our grandkids wish for wars these days. I don't know, maybe for an MBA, but not necessarily for a war. So here we have Hamilton at an age of probably 17 or 18, depending on his date of birth, leaving the West Indies, coming as an immigrant to the colonies. He lands in Boston, immediately travels to New York, where he will remain. And here's how Lin-Manuel, in his brilliance, encapsulates and suggests the mood and the attitude of Hamilton as he saw it, as reflected in Chernow's book. "Howard is a bastard orphan, son of a whore, and a Scotsman dropped in the middle of a foreign spot, in the Caribbean by Providence, impoverished, in squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar." Listen to the rhythm, listen to the text. Let me repeat it again, it's very powerful. "Howard is a bastard orphan, son of a whore, and a Scotsman dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by Providence, impoverished, in squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar." Well, that's kind of the mood, that's kind of the rhythm, that's kind of the verbiage those who have seen the show have come to expect. And then he gives an answer a little later on in the show. "The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter." Well, that tells you a lot about Alexander Hamilton. All right, he's in America now. It's 1772, 1773. The guy wanted a war. All of you know he got his war. What a time. What a time to come to America. He's young, he's ambitious, he's adventurous, he's brave. And the agitation, which started in 1763, is reaching a peak in 1772 and 1773. He's in New York City. It's an exciting, dynamic place. But the first thing he wants to do is go to college. So he decides to enter Princeton. So he goes there, he speaks to the president of Princeton, and he says, "Look, I want an accelerated course. I don't have time to spend all these years at Princeton. Give me an accelerated course. President Witherspoon says, no, no, no. We've done it for a few others. It hasn't worked out too well. You've got to take the normal period of time. And Hamilton decides Princeton is not for him. So he returns to New York and he signs into King's College, which after the war, obviously, is going to change its name to Columbia College. So here he is in New York. Turbulence is beginning to peak. He joins the Sons of Liberty, which is a group of radicals agitating against the British. He studies at the same time. He studies military tactics. There is an event where a mob threatens to tar and feather the president of Columbia. Hamilton gets up, stands on the steps, and dissuades the mob from entering the president's quarters, allowing the president to flee to safety. So here we have Hamilton already confronting the mob, and as you will see later on, having all sorts of apprehension and fear about the capacity of mobs to do damage. He's also starting to writing pamphlets against the British, refuting those who are defending the British. This is a very literate revolution. Everyone is writing broadsides, pamphlets, editorials in the newspapers. The most famous one, of course, that all of you know is written by Tom Paine, Common Sense. But this was a revolution in which people felt they had to explain why they were doing what they did. He also forms a militia group with his college buddies. They go down to the Battery, down at the tip of Manhattan. They steal British cannons away from the fort there, and now they become an artillery unit. So here we have Hamilton, young, fresh, ambitious, in college. College closes once the war begins. Remember, the war begins essentially in April of '75 with Lexington and Concord, and then shortly thereafter, the Battle of Bunker Hill. So war is declared, underway, the college closes. He's now in a militia group, and our friend Alexander Hamilton has his war. He wanted the war, and he got it. And I must say, if you follow his military career for the first few years, he is a hero. He is elected captain by the militia. He fights in the Battle of Brooklyn, which was a severe defeat for the American forces under Washington. Fortunately for them, they escaped to Manhattan because there was a fog, and they were able to get their boats across before the British found out. They then go up to Fort Washington near the George Washington Bridge. And Hamilton's role there is to cover for them, to allow these troops to escape into New Jersey, where there is another fort, Fort Lee. It took a little doing. There was no easy pass back then, but they did get across, and Hamilton was responsible for enabling them to escape the British, which was a critical turning point in the war. He then fights in the Battle of Princeton. He fights in the Battle of Trenton and many others. I mean, he is a fighter and is recognized for it, because any number of generals now approach Hamilton. They want him on their general staff. They want him to become an aide de camp. Now imagine this, the guy is in his early 20s, and Washington calls on him and says, Hamilton, I want you to join my general staff as an aide de camp. Hamilton, of course, likes the glory of the battlefield, but you don't turn down George Washington. And for the next 4 years, Hamilton is the aide de camp. There are others, but he is the primary aide de camp to General George Washington. He writes his correspondence. He speaks and writes French, so he communicates with Lafayette, which George Washington could not do. He captures Washington's mind so that the letters that go out sound like and appear to be coming from George Washington himself. And there is an excellent collaboration between George and Alex. In fact, many historians say that their closeness, their ability to kind of read each other's minds was close to a father and son relationship for this period of time, because he has a lot of responsibility. He talks to the generals. He runs a spy network. He is in charge of prisoner exchanges. I mean, here is a kid, imagine this, in his early 20s, given these responsibilities in the midst of this bloody, brutal war. The other thing that comes out of his being an aide is that he doesn't really favor any one particular colony. He has an overall view. He's trying to win the war for the Continental Army. He does not favor Virginia or New York or New Jersey or Rhode Island. He sees the whole picture, and that, of course, will be very critical in the years to come. And the final point about his war service, at least under Washington, he was totally frustrated with Congress. There was a Congress operating, the Continental Congress, you've probably heard the name. They were appealed to, send money, send supplies, help us, do what you can. And Congress kind of sat on its heels, was of very limited use to George and the Continental Army. But here we have Hamilton as the aide-de-camp, smarting, frustrating that he's not back on the battlefield. He asks George, please give me a field command. And George says, you know, you're too important to me. You're more important here than on the field. And Hamilton is getting frustrated. Then there comes an event. George had called Alex in to confer with him. And while he was going up, George was on the second floor of this house. He runs into Lafayette on the first floor, and he starts conversing with Lafayette, about 10 minutes long, and George loses his temper. He said, I called upon you. Stop conversing with Lafayette. Get up here immediately. And I must say that Alex took affront. He said, no matter who you are, George Washington, you can't talk like that to me. I'm going to resign. I'm leaving. George apologizes. He runs after him. But Alex is determined. He says, look, and Alex in his letters admits that George can be short-tempered. He loses his patience very often, understandably. But on this occasion, Alex says, I've had enough. I'm leaving. And George finally relents and says, okay, you want a field command? I'll give you a field command. And fortunately for Alexander Hamilton, he gets a command of a New York military force that is traveling to Yorktown, Virginia, for what turns out to be the climactic battle of the war, the last major battle. Interesting in and of itself. This was not hit and run. This was not guerrilla warfare. The British had built fortifications, trenches, and were doing things that traditional soldiers and armies do back in Europe. Reason the British lost is that the British fleet was sent from New York to relieve the British troops at Yorktown. But at this particular time, and quite fortuitously, a French fleet arrived from the West Indies. And as you know, or maybe you don't, the French were allied with the colonies in the Revolutionary War. And at this particular battle, there were more French troops than there were American troops. Nonetheless, Hamilton is given this command. He really taunts the British. He drills his troops in front of the British fortifications, really ticking them off. And then he plans and succeeds in a midnight assault Obviously, it's dark. There are flares going up all over the place. And in a frontal assault led by Alexander Hamilton with a fixed bayonet, he overcomes the British fortifications. In fact, he was so short that he had a soldier in front of him. He went up his back in order to get over the wall to assault the French troops. So there you have Hamilton's wartime acclaim, a hero, an aide to Washington, and the victor in the battle, the last major battle. It was 1781. There were a few skirmishes after that, but essentially the war was over and the Americans had triumphed. Any thoughts or any comments before we move on to the last stages of his life? Okay, now what? Now what? And here's what Lin-Manuel has Hamilton say. My name is Alexander Hamilton, and there's a million things I haven't done. And just you wait. Just you wait. So what does he do? He gets married. He marries Eliza Schuyler. As I've said to you before, her father, Philip Schuyler, was, there she is, Eliza Schuyler, who would live on to the age of 94, always cherishing her relationship with Alex, keeping a piece of paper that he wrote on her neck in a bracelet. And she would later compile all of his letters. Why this sounds a little unusual, you'll soon hear, because she may have had every reason to forget her relationship with Alexander Hamilton. Okay, so here he is. War is over. He's married. He starts having children. I think in the end, he had 8 children with Eliza. And now he wants to become a lawyer. He goes back to New York. And what he does is read. He reads the law. And within 6 months, I mean, the guy was incredible. Within 6 months, he passes the bar. He's allowed into a practice before the New York judiciary. And the notes he took, the compilations he took about New York law became a standard text for all would-be lawyers for generations to come. So he has a law practice which is quite successful. Interestingly, he defends Tories, those who oppose the American Revolution. After the war, there are a lot of reprisals against Tories who didn't flee the country, trying to confiscate their property. And Alexander Hamilton defends them. One, he thought it was right to do so because the treaty with England that was signed at the end of the war called upon the Americans to honor the debts even of the British and the American Tories, not to confiscate their property. And so Hamilton feels justified in doing this. He also defends runaway slaves. During the war, a lot of slaves ran away from the South and parts of the North as well. And he also joins and is instrumental in organizing a manumission and emancipation society in New York. Many of the northern states would later go for what we call gradual emancipation. They didn't free the slaves at once. What they did is pass laws that said a slave upon reaching the age of 21 or 25 would then go free. So if you had purchased a slave, which many did in the North, you would not have your slave confiscated, but you would have, quote, the services of a slave until that slave turned the age of emancipation. He also founded a bank, the Bank of New York, which is still around. He founded a newspaper, the New York Post, which is still around. So he was quite active on the local scene. Nationally, of course, he has higher aspirations. Namely, as I said, he had seen the national perspective when working for Washington. He felt the United States, or what would become the United States, needed a more powerful government, and that he would be instrumental in trying to form one. As he said in the play, I am not throwing away my shot. I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot. Well, he saw the opportunity, and I guess we should, although it's already become pretty clear the kind of guy he was, ambitious, energetic. Every time you saw him, he was always pacing. He never stood still. He talked to himself. He mumbled. He was insecure in part because of his illegitimate birth. His mother had not been married to James Hamilton when he was born. There is a lovely picture of our man, good-looking guy. He liked the ladies liked him. In fact, there are hints of an affair that he had with Liza's sister, Angelica Schuyler, never been confirmed, but they were very close. That is Angelica and Alexander Hamilton. So he's driven, he feels insecure, he's touchy, he's combative, he's worried about his honor, given his low birth. He's a thinker, he's a doer. He's got tremendous capacity for hard work. He'll sit down and write for 7-8 hours at a time. He wrote 10,000 letters. His collected papers occupy 27 volumes, thick volumes. He could talk. At the Constitutional Convention, he spoke for 6 hours without stopping. When he was in Washington's cabinet with Jefferson, Jefferson complained that Hamilton would start talking, would not finish for 45 minutes, as if he was talking to a jury. And he was, I guess he believed it, and I guess there's some basis for it, the smartest person in the room. And he kind of felt a bit distant from America. At one point he said, and I'm not sure the context, he said, this America was not made for me. In some sense, he was on the periphery, even though he was incorporated into the government and the social circles of Philadelphia and later New York. I should point out that the capital of the United States for the first 10 years was not Washington, D.C., but Philadelphia. Then, of course, stuff that you all know, which I will simply mention, he and others like him, and he persuades Washington to join him, felt that the government that came out after the revolution, you probably were taught it was called the Articles of Confederation government, was weak, had no taxing authority, there was no capital, it moved around a lot. A lot of states didn't even bother sending representatives. Foreign nations didn't take us seriously. So a lot of those who fought the revolution said, is this what we fought for? We need a stronger central government. And Hamilton was in the forefront, along with Madison and Washington and John Jay and others, to eventually call for this convention in Philadelphia in 1787. It was to be in secret because it was supposed to change the articles, not scrap them entirely and start with the new Constitution. So you should know that Hamilton was not a major player at the Constitutional Convention. He was outvoted by the New York delegation, and therefore his voice was submerged under theirs. He got up and made a speech about, establishing a very strong life president senators to be elected for life. People said he was out of touch, even though he was using this as a bargaining position. And so the influence of Hamilton on the Constitution comes later when he writes, along with Madison and John Jay, those famous Federalist Papers in which he tries to explain why it's important to adopt the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution has to be ratified, approved by the states. And of course, it's done. And now the new government is in place. And now we reach finally Hamilton's greatest hits. And he's back together with Washington. Washington appoints him to be Secretary of the Treasury. And you might say, in all fairness, he's the greatest Secretary of the Treasury we've ever had. He's in the cabinet with Thomas Jefferson and with Henry Knox, who is the Secretary of War. Jefferson is Secretary of State. And even though you all know that Jefferson and Hamilton would be at odds and they'd form two political parties, initially they were friendly. They sat down together in the cabinet. In 1790, George took both of them blue fishing off Sandy Hook. They seemed to have a nice time together, but again, there would be eventually a falling out because of their different ideological positions. So Hamilton's greatest achievement was as Secretary of the Treasury, putting American accounts on the right path to solvency. What he did was absolutely ingenious. He took over the debts. He took over the debts of the states. He took over the debts of individuals. He was prepared to pay them back at face value, figuring that he would get the well-to-do to support the government if they wanted to be paid back at face value, which many of them did because they had picked up all this currency, all these bonds, all these IOUs at severely depreciated prices. So he had the brilliance to give debt to the national government, provide revenue sources, build a bank, establish a mint, establish customs authority, build lighthouses. I mean, he did it all. He did it all. In addition to establishing a national bank, in addition to writing a very influential report on manufacturing, he said, look, we're at 95% agricultural. We've got to look to the future. Our future is commerce, our future is manufacturing, and therefore we've got to establish tariffs, we've got to establish a tax system, we've got to encourage skilled workmen from Europe to come to this country. He was very, very foresighted to see that the future of America, unlike Jefferson, who said we would do well to stay yeoman farmers, Hamilton said our future, yeah, it's going to be farming, but farming in collaboration with commerce and industry. Brilliant, brilliant. He stayed in the cabinet until 1795, but there was one bad scene which essentially would do him in. I don't know if you know this story. I'll give it to you quickly. But he was in Philadelphia while Eliza and the family were up in Albany staying with her father. And one day, this woman by the name of Maria Reynolds walks into his office and says she's been abandoned by her husband. She's impoverished. She doesn't know what to do. Could he lend her some money? Well, turns out she was a very handsome, beautiful woman. So what Hamilton does is shortly thereafter, he goes to her quarters. She invites him up to her room, and he then begins a rather amorous affair with Maria Reynolds that lasts about a year, but it turns out it's a scam. Namely, that Reynolds's husband had set Hamilton up hoping that he would be taken in by her charms. And he begins to extort money from Hamilton to keep this secret hush-hush. Obviously, word gets around that something phony and crazy is going on with Hamilton. He is then accused of paying Maria Reynolds off by taking money from the US Treasury. And this becomes a whole to-do and forces Hamilton to write a 70-page letter explaining just what happened, admitting that he was enthralled and he was entrapped by Maria. The money was his, the money was not the Treasury Department, but he actually wrote a lengthy explanation of just what happened. And of course, this did not redound to his credit. I must say, as I hinted before, his wife at first was, needless to say, taken aback. I'm not sure how they patched things up, but they did. And she remained ever faithful to him, and he remained ever loving to her. We have letters of his to her for the rest of his life. Okay, what we finally conclude with is something that you all know, the famous or infamous duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. That's what gentlemen did when they felt affronted, when they felt their honor had been questioned. If they couldn't work things out, and here we have Joy putting on a picture of the duel, which I'm about to describe, taking place Weehawken, New Jersey. Nothing much good ever comes out of New Jersey, as you can see. But let's get to how all that came about. Hamilton was no stranger to duels. He had been involved in 10 duels prior to this time, 3 as a second and 7 as a principal. But in all the others, as often was the case, they'd have a duel, a challenge had been made, they'd meet at the appointed location with seconds, and ordinarily their seconds worked things out, and that was the end of it. They showed up, they were prepared to fire, but they never did. Or if they did, they fired into the ground. So that's kind of what might have been expected this time. As I say, usually more symbolic. Don't want to get into all the details, but Burr and Hamilton had a history. You might say they were frenemies. They had been in the war together. They did some work together. They were both lawyers in New York, but Hamilton got in the way of Burr on several occasions. The most recent was in 1800, when Burr was angling to become president. Too complicated to get into the technicalities, but Hamilton threw his weight on the side of Jefferson, who had been his rival, and enabled Jefferson, even though both had received the same number of electoral votes, Hamilton threw his influence behind Jefferson and kept Burr from becoming our president in 1800. Then Burr tried to run for governor of New York in 1804. And once again, Hamilton was very critical of Burr. Here's one of Hamilton's comments regarding Aaron Burr. Quote, "As a public man, he is one of the worst sort, a friend to nothing, but as it suits his interest and ambition. In a word, if we have an embryo Caesar in the United States, 'tis Burr." So he was very distrustful of Burr. So was George Washington. And I should also point out that Hamilton's son, Philip, in 1801, 3 years before this duel, also took affront when someone criticized his father, Alex, and they had a duel Also in Weehawken, there is Philip the son, and Philip is killed at Weehawken defending his father's honor in 1801. I should also point out, as a bit of trivia, the same pistols that Philip used, Alex would use in 1804. So Burr, obviously ticked off by Hamilton standing in the way of his becoming governor, challenges him to a duel. And Hamilton writes a letter. He said, I should not participate in this duel. It's not fair to my family. It's not fair to my kids. It's against my religion. I'm heavily in debt. What will my debtors do? But why am I going to go ahead with this? His rationalization was, I still have much to provide in service to the nation. If I back out of this, if I turn the other cheek, I will be dishonored and my standing among the public will be diminished. So I've got to go through with this, although he later writes in a letter he did not intend to fire at Burr. So here we have July 12th, 1804, Hamilton and his seconds row across the Hudson, which, as you know, is pretty wide at that place. Burr and his seconds row across the Hudson at 6 a.m. Now you say, why did they go to Weehawken? New York had more strict laws against dueling than did Jersey. And even though Jersey had laws, they rarely enforced them. In fact, there had been in the late 18th and 19th centuries, 19 separate duels fought at Weehawken. So that's where they go. So they line up. In a duel, you are obliged to stand at least 10 yards apart. The seconds look the other way. They will not directly observe the event so that they have plausible deniability. When they're later asked, did you witness the duel? They can truthfully say, no, we did not witness the duel. Now, a lot of this gets a little fuzzy. Since they did not witness it, it's not entirely clear what happened. The evidence seems to be that Burr fired first and fired high into a tree. Later, they went and retrieved the bullet. Others say that he fired high into the tree because he was hit by Burr's bullet, and that's what knocked his aim off. We will never know. We will never know. Burr is untouched. Hamilton receives a mortal blow, a mortal wound. He is then carried back to his boat by his seconds. He's rowed across the Hudson, and 36 hours later, he passes away in the presence of his wife, his children, and 20 of his friends. And they deliver the letter he had written, expecting that he could be killed. He could be killed. And he writes to Eliza, quote, I shall cherish the sweet hope of meeting you in a better world. Adieu, best of wives, best of women. Embrace all my darling children for me. He passes away. He is buried in Trinity Church downtown. You can still visit the grave of Alexander Hamilton. There is a statue, I've not been there, at Weehawken with of Alexander Hamilton, but those who've been there say it's not really worth much doing because they built railroad tracks later in the 19th century. It is not a primary location. And thus, passes from the scene one of the greatest of the founding fathers, who at last has finally gotten his due. Thanks to Chernow and thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda. And thank you all for coming and listening to the story of Alexander Hamilton. And there is Lin-Manuel playing the role, as you all know. Quite extraordinary, as I said, writing the rap lyrics, writing the songs, and being the primary mover in this extraordinary Broadway production, which will go on and on and on for years. As you know, Disney recorded it, and if you have the Disney link, you can see it. I would recommend you read the lyrics first, because you'd find it hard. I'm sure those of you who've been to the show find it hard to understand, because it's so thick and the rap is often difficult to follow, that unless you are familiar with the lyrics, you're going to miss. I mean, there are some puns in it. One I don't fully appreciate. At the beginning, Hamilton claims that he punched the bursar at Princeton. Why he punched the bursar at Princeton, I don't know. But here is Lin-Manuel setting up a pun, because later when Hamilton meets Burr, he keeps saying bursar, bursar, which is a pun, not particularly funny, but I guess it was funny to Lin-Manuel at some point. But again, either you get it or you don't get it. But again, the lyrics are terrific. The amount of information embedded in the lyrics is extraordinary for a historical show of that sort. I certainly would welcome and hopefully respond to, now that we've elevated Hamilton to front stage, the curtain is still up. Lynn is taking his bows, so we can see if there's anything about what I've said or what I didn't say. It's so thick. I mean, his accomplishments, as well as the other founding fathers, they are men of action. They are young. Take note how young they are. And if you look at your Constitution and mine, what does it say? You can become a member of Congress at age 25. You become a senator at age 30. And you can become president of the United States at age 35. Why did they do this? Because they were all, for the most part, young men themselves, and they wanted to make the new government available to their youthful energies, and so they gave these youthful qualifications to hold federal office. Rather interesting.
Richard.
Joy is, yes.
I have a question. You know, in today's movement after what some call cancel culture or whatever, Thomas Jefferson has dropped many levels of coolness, if you will, right? You know, he owned slaves. He, in fact, it was a Jewish family, Uriah Phillips Levy, that rescued Monticello from destruction. And Hamilton, who was his opponent, you know, federal government versus states' right, is now on the ascendancy. Any thoughts about, you know, Jefferson's all men are created equal and all that, and then, you know, owning all these slaves, which he, unlike Washington, did not set free. He was so indebted that he couldn't. Anything, any thoughts on that, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, Lin-Manuel said he created this play in part to demonstrate that Hamilton's vision for America would be the kind of America that emerged. I mean, Hamilton's vision of a commercial, industrial, capitalistic society is what we've had. And Jefferson might be the sentimental favorite, but he essentially thought that we ought to remain farmers because he said they were innately virtuous. And so, he was the spokesperson for a point of view that sentimentally we still are attracted to, but it's not the America that became. But I should also point out that Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, also owned slaves, and Hamilton seemed not to object to that, not that he could have done much about it. But you're quite right, Jim, that Jefferson has lost something in stature, although he was considerably taller. Jefferson was 6'2" or 6'3", and Hamilton was 5'7". Madison was 5'4". So we've got a young crop, and of course Washington was 6'2". So we've got tall guys and short guys, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the founding fathers take turns in being elevated. I think Franklin has remained a father figure throughout. I'm thinking maybe my next book should be try to elevate Benedict Arnold. Who knows? Maybe there's something there that could put him into the fore, at least before he turns traitor. But I've
Ulysses Grant. Do Ulysses Grant like Chernow's rehabilitation of Grant?
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating story. As you know, when it comes to evaluating presidents, for example, they rise and they fall depending upon how historians at particular times that they live in view them. Eisenhower used to be dismissed. Now he's elevated. Truman used to be dismissed. Now he's elevated. Historians look at the past from different perspectives, and therefore history is constantly in flux. That's why I've always enjoyed it. It's never one story. It's always revisited, revised. You are in history a revisionist or you're a mainliner, but most historians like to be revisionists and give a altered view from the conventional wisdom.
Well, in line with that, Richard, how would history have been different had Hamilton not been killed in that duel at that time? Would it have been a huge difference?
That's a great question. The reason, people who answer questions always say it's a great question so long as they think they have an answer for it.
Right.
If they don't have an answer, they say, well, it's irrelevant. I don't have to. No, that's a great question. The reason it is that he had no future. By that, I mean the Federalist Party, to which he was a founding member, had pretty much given up the ghost by about 1800 and would soon die out. So he hitched his wagon to a party that would essentially fade. They were out of step with the public. They were a commercial party, an urban party in part, whereas America was a fundamentally rural nation. 95% of the people were involved in agriculture. So Lois, my answer to the question would be, what he had planned to do, this we know from his letters, he was going to write volumes on explaining the United States government and its structure. So he was going to be, someone said today, if Alexander were alive, he'd be a professor at Harvard, probably at the Kennedy School, and he'd be called into CNN to give his opinions on any number of events. Wow. So his political future was over, but of course he was a young man. He was not even 50. He certainly, his wife, as I said, lived on till 95. She became a very influential person in setting up an asylum for orphans in New York. She was concerned with children, and my wife happens to be a member of the Schuyler Center, which is still around as an advocacy group, very influential in New York State. And she is a board member, and their primary concern is child welfare. And all of that grows out of Eliza Schuyler's work for many, many years in connection with child welfare in New York.
I think something interesting, building off of what James was saying, is even the show. There was an article written recently, I don't know if it was in the Times, but it was talking after the release of the film on Disney, of the recording of the show on Disney Plus. And even how in 2015, when the show was first released, seeing African American and Latino and Latina actresses and actors play these characters took even a different meaning then, as opposed to seeing them now in 2020 after, you know, the recent incidences after, you know, George Floyd, and how certain people, you know, now when they see James Madison and they see him as an African American, there's a different twist on it. It's not always in the, you know, for many of us, it was revolutionary and amazing, but there's some very interesting articles about even viewing this in a 2020 light. It even takes on more meaning about viewing slave owners as, you know, and there's all sorts of back and forth, whether it is correct to have people of color portray slave owners. I think that as much as also the legacy of the people who they were, also the legacy of this show, which is amazing. It will continue to evolve based on the audience that views it and the time period in which they're viewing it.
Miranda's show got its start at the Public Theater, and Public Theater is known for its very diverse casting in just about any show. This is something that goes back to Joe Papp over 50 years ago. But Miranda, it's a pleasure to see, and just to get the feeling, whatever the actor is, it's the actor's interpretation or the casting of the actor, and that's very enjoyable.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, Barbara. And Joy should let us in on a little secret that her best friend was a classmate of Lynn. Tell us a little about that, Joy.
Sure.
We're 20 minutes from the hotel.
My sister-in-law, who has been my best friend since I'm 11, went to high school with Lynn. So I've known him since I'm about 14. And I remember actually when he first wrote In the Heights, and all the things that came along with that and how revolutionary it was, and when he first started to get noticed. And I remember first hearing from my friend Lona, who is my sister-in-law, that Lynn would be writing a show about Hamilton and you know, his process, because they're friends for a very long time, and then all of a sudden it was all the rage. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I think his story has its own comparisons to, yes, you talked about him being the child of immigrants, but also he was this kid from the Heights. He went to Hunter College High School. He's a product of some of the best things that public education has to offer. So I think for many of us, even if you know him or not, just his story connects a lot to Alexander's as well. So yes, I do know Lynn, and I know him for a long time. So it's exciting on many levels to hear people sitting around and talking to him. I think about him. I think when I saw the first show he directed when my sister-in-law was 15, I don't think any of us imagined this. So it's pretty amazing.
There was an interview that he did. There was an interview that he did where he talked about how Alexander Hamilton's story really, really resonated with him because of the whole immigrant thing. He talked about the fact that it resonated with him with his own family. So I actually heard an interview where he said exactly those words, Joy. So.
Yeah, and someone said, he may have said it himself, that although In the Heights reflected his neighborhood experience, Hamilton was really closer to his heart and closer to his feelings than was In the Heights, and for reasons that you've already indicated, namely identifying with the immigrant experience of his father and I guess his generation as well. So, but Joy's point about the show evolving once we get back to showing it in terms of current concerns and preoccupations is fascinating. And I wouldn't be surprised if he alters some of the script to accommodate the new developments because he keeps going back to the show, and Chernow says he's been invited many times to sit in on the show. I've never heard of a collaboration between a historian and a dramatist so close as this one turned out to be. So they're quite friendly, and I guess the show will go on. There'll be a road show, needless to say, and it'll remain on Broadway, I would expect, indefinitely once it returns.
Apparently his wedding, the wedding party did a rendition of L'Chaim from Fiddler on the Roof that was supposed to be incredible. So there's yet another Jewish connection to Lin-Miranda Hamilton. So.
Yeah, and you know, he performed his first rap song for Obama in the White House.
Yeah.
He had planned to do another song, but he said, look, I want to try it out on the president, get his reaction, because that would mean something. And he took a chance. I mean, after all, putting it in rap is taking a chance, but it was a brilliant innovation. And of course, the rest is history, as it always is.
Many of the Secretary of Treasury were at the opening of the play. Robert Rudin, Jacob Lew, a lot of the Secretary of Treasuries of the United States went to see the play because it dealt with the, Secretary of Treasury.
There also is a recording on YouTube that you can watch of the original cast doing, I don't think it's the whole show, but even after it was, the full show was released, they went and performed portions of it in the White House, not only for President Obama, but for other members of the cabinet. And to see this show and hearing about all of the founding fathers while they're standing in, I don't know, the blue room or the green room or whatever it's called, but there's something really powerful about that too, to see the setting of, to see what they're talking about in this setting it's pretty powerful.
But
By the way, go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying, there's always a downer, and there's always a but, because now he's getting what's the word? He's being told, how come you didn't put the slavery? You never mentioned slavery in this play, and so there's always someone
poetic justice, a poetic license, rather.
Well, no.
Yeah, I should say in that connection, during the war, his friend John Lawrence from South Carolina did recommend to the Carolina legislature that slaves be freed and armed
10 minutes.
to fight against the British. And Hamilton supported Lawrence, who was his friend. They were both aides-de-camp to Washington. Hamilton did favor arming slaves and incorporating them into the Continental Army. The South Carolina legislature, for obvious reasons, voted against it, but the idea was put forth, and Hamilton did favor it, and probably would have approved it had it taken place.
But what I'm talking about is the fact that slavery was a very tiny bit mentioned in the play. That's what they're talking about now. That it was not really brought up at all. Not having seen the play, I'm just telling you what, there's always people who will carp.
Well, Chernow was asked about that, how deep and how committed Hamilton was to the slavery cause or the anti-slavery cause. And Chernow's answer was, I've read everything he's written, every letter, every memo. And if you know Alexander Hamilton, when he gets on a topic which is important to him, he'll write the hell out of it, and he will examine it from all sides. And he never did on the subject of slavery. So Chernow's conclusion was that he was inclined against it, but did not, he might have in later years, because as you see, various states in the North passed what they call personal liberty laws. Because the Constitution, if you read the Constitution, it says that if a slave escapes from a slave state into a free state, that free state has the obligation to return that slave back to where it came from. And personal liberty laws were passed in the North. This became a major bone of contention that would lead to the Civil War. Northern states passed laws trying to block the return of escaped slaves back to their owners in the South.
Right.
So to some degree, Hamilton was involved in that situation.
We have a slave hiding place right now.
Any other questions?
Richard,
Once again,
thank you so much. This was so interesting.
Well, thank you all for joining. All you folks are a pleasure to see, and the fact that we're able to get together, and Joy made this all possible. Now she can hit the road again and head along her trip, but
Your fan
she
club.
handled it expertly as always. And again, our ability to get together and see each other in these times is precious.